Hey there, welcome to my Zero to Hero guide on the Astrologian. The Astrologian may be one of the most convoluted and difficult jobs in the entire game to play optimally. And that may be a little bit discouraging, especially if you are a brand new player. But by the time this video is over, even if you have never played 14 before in your life, you will walk out of here with greater understanding and competence with the Astrologian than the majority of endgame raiders. And if you find this helpful or useful or what have you, leave me some free engagement bait, like subs or sassy comments. You know how it goes. Let's get on with it. Now, first of all, if you have not yet unlocked the Astrologian, but you have been lured in by the prospect of a job wielding glitter bombs and Yu-Gi-Oh cards, all you have to do is visit these coordinates in Ishgard and speak to the NPC inside of this guild, and they'll hand over the job to you. Now, dear astrology girly in the making, in order to expand your horizons and begin your career scamming people in Los Angeles out of a tent, you are going to need to understand the basics of the Astrologian. As a diviner and a fortune teller, the Astrologian's kit is comprised of two main mechanics that make it the unique and versatile job that it is. First of all, we have delayed heals, which allow us to save our allies by knowing when they're going to take damage before they do. And secondly, we have our wide variety of single target buffs we can use to bless our allies during combat. With that little description out of the way, we can stop telling you about the job and start telling you how to play it. Something you should be aware of if you're a new player or you're not really into high-end content is the ABCs of 14, as some players call it. ABC in this case stands for Always Be Casting. It is sort of a joke, but there is some very serious, genuine truth to it. You see, the most important part of playing any job correctly in Final Fantasy XIV is to ensure the global cooldown never stops rolling. The global cooldown, of course, being the shared cooldown that all of your spells or weapon skills utilize. You can tell what they are by hovering over them and reading the tooltip right here. The spell you will be using to keep the GCD rolling is Malefic. This is the first spell you ever learn, and it will be the spell you use to contribute to your party in dungeons, raids, so on and so forth. As you level up, it will evolve from Malefic 1, changing its namesake and animation, but remaining functionally identical. To properly use Malefic, all you have to do is spam it. The objective is to get as many Malefics off as you can in the course of a fight in order to help your party by contributing to their damage output alongside keeping them alive. There are some other buttons that are more important than Malefic, but Malefic is your general go-to filler button, and it's what we'll be pressing the most. On the subject of other buttons that are more important than Malefic, we have Gravity. This is literally your AoE equivalent to Malefic. Anytime there is more than one enemy grouped up, we'll use Gravity in place of Malefic. Otherwise, they are the exact same thing. This is Combust, your single target damage over time spell. It does a massive amount of damage over the course of 30 seconds, so apply it once at the beginning of a fight and then recast it whenever you see that there are 2 seconds or less remaining on the debuff. And as a little extra tip, you can take advantage of the fact that Combust can be used while moving by individually casting it on dungeon mobs before your tank has finished pulling everything to the end of the room. That way, you can get your Combusts off early enough that they'll be able to use up most of their duration and not have to lose out on any gravity casts to do so. Do make sure that your tank has gotten to do damage to the mob at least once before you combust it. That way the mob doesn't aggro on you instead of the tank. That's generally inconsequential, but some tank players get mad about it, so just be careful. Executing the ability Astral Draw will pull 4 specific cards from your deck, and then the ability will transform into Umbral Draw for the next time you cast it. Your cards will then be displayed right here in the Arcana gauge. Now each card has its own unique effect, and there are 8 cards total. You can play your cards by executing the play 1, 2, 3, and minor arcana abilities. Now, 8 cards might sound like a lot to memorize, so here are some easy ways to keep track of what is what. Anything bound to play 1 is a damage buff. Anything bound to play 2 is a defensive buff. Anything bound to play 3 is a restorative buff. And anything bound to minor arcana is not a buff, but instead deals instant damage or instant healing to everything around you. Now, remembering play 1, 2, 3, and minor arcana will make it easier for you to get used to the Astrologian. But to play it properly, we're going to need to know what each card actually does on its own. So, we're going to go over them one at a time, starting with... The Balance is a card that applies a damage buff to your target for 15 seconds. If your target is a melee or a tank job, the card will apply a 6% damage buff. If they are not a melee or a tank job, they will instead only receive half of that value, at 3%. This card should be used by handing it off to the strongest melee DPS in your party. If your party doesn't have a melee DPS, you can give it to Dark Knight players or just the strongest DPS you have. The Arrow grants a buff to your target that increases the healing they receive by 10% for the next 15 seconds. This buff is special in that it is one of the few healing buffs in the game that increases the healing received from all sources except potions, unlike most healing buffs that only apply to certain types of healing. Use this card by granting it to whatever target requires healing the most. The Spire applies a 400 potency HP barrier to your target for the next 30 seconds. This card can be used freely on anybody who is taking damage. And if you apply the arrow to your target first and then give them the Spire's shield will actually benefit from the healing buff and increase its potency by 40. The Lord of Crowns is also not a buff. Instead, it deals instant damage to all nearby enemies with a potency of 400. This card should always be used immediately after the Balance, right before we redraw and pull the Spear. The only time we would use the Lord of Crowns outside of our burst window, which we haven't talked about yet, is when there's multiple enemies at once and we can multiply the value of our Lord of Crowns by dropping it on 2+ targets. The Spear grants a damage buff to your targeted party member for 15 seconds. The buff will grant 6% bonus damage to any physical ranged, caster, or healer jobs. And if it is granted to a melee DPS or a tank, the effect will be cut in half and only give 3%. Now, if you have been paying attention, you might notice this card is literally the exact opposite of the Balance, and that is true. The simplest way to use this card is just give it to your ranged DPS, and if you don't have one, just give it to whoever you handed off the Balance to. One more thing to note about the Balance and the Spear, these cards have a very specific time you want to use them at, and your entire rotation is going to be based around setting that up. Now, we're going to talk about that in a later section, but for now, just remember the Balance and the Spear are a pair, and they will always be used together. The Bowl is a 10% damage mitigation buff. It can be granted to tanks to assist them with handling tank busters, auto attacks, or tanking mobs in dungeons. However, you can also use it during raids and trials to assist any allies who have messed up mechanics and might need a little bit of extra help surviving the oncoming raid wides. Use this card very freely, because oftentimes it does end up getting wasted when it comes time to redraw. Which, if I haven't mentioned yet, we do have specific redraw times we have to follow, though we'll talk about that more later. The Ewer grants a 15-second health regeneration effect to your target. Now, this card, much like your other defensive cards, can be used very freely. Now, thankfully, the Ewer, being the only card that actually restores health on its own, can be used on just about anybody, and as long as the person you are targeting isn't at immediate risk of dying and needs an instant burst heal, it is a good idea to give them the Ewer first, because we want to get as much value as we can out of this card, and if we don't, we might end up just having to waste it when it becomes redraw time. The Lady of Crowns is not a buff, and instead grants an instant 400 potency heal to all party members nearby. In order to get the most value out of the Lady of Crowns, simply use it whenever your party is missing HP or there are at least 3 people who need healing. The Lady of Crowns is not a card that you typically plan your healing around, it's more of an extra freebie unless you're doing high-end content. So just use it whensoever it's available and there's someone who will benefit from it. Now here is how you draw your cards correctly, because there is a very specific and correct way to do it. When you have 55 seconds left on the cooldown of Divination, this is an action that you use at the start of the fight, 7 seconds into it, and then recast every 2 minutes, the very moment it is ready. You are going to use Astral Draw. Astral Draw will always be used at the 55-second mark of Divination's cooldown. That might sound a bit weird, but the reason for it is very simple. Divination is going to grant a buff, and at the very beginning of that buff, we need to play the Balance, the Lord of Crowns, and the Spear in that order. So what we're going to do is use Astral Draw at the 55-second mark of Divination's cooldown. Then we are going to hold on to the Balance and the Lord of Crowns, because of course we want to use it during Divination, so we're not going to use it earlier, obviously. Then, after that 55-second time window is up, and we cast Divination again, we're going to play the Balance on our DPS, we're going to play the Lord of Crowns on everything, and then we're going to have Umbral Draw's cooldown ready by then. So we're going to use Umbral Draw and redraw all of our cards, and now we're going to have the Spear in hand. And like I said, the Balance and the Spear are partners. They will always, always, always go out together, which means now we can play the Spear on whatever DPS it needs to go out to, and that is how you handle your card redraws. Just remember, you draw once at the 55-second mark of Divination's cooldown, and then you draw again about 3 seconds after you've used Divination. And then just loop that forever until the fight is over. Oh, and because I've gotten this question before, yes, you are still going to redraw, even if that means you have to throw away any of your defensive cards. When you're using Astral Draw at the start of a fight, you're going to have to throw away the Arrow and the Spire. And the truth is, the Arrow and the Spire are not going to accomplish anything but get in the way if we don't throw them away at the beginning of the fight. And by the time we have to do our set redraws at 55 seconds or during Divination, if we still have some of our defensive cards left over at that time, that means the card just gets wasted. So that's why we want to try to use these cards freely during the windows that we have them before they get redrawn. Now that you know how your cards work, we're going to go over 3 of the most important abilities to Astro's overall playstyle. These are Lightspeed, Divination, and Earthly Star. First of all, we have Lightspeed. This ability grants you a 15-second buff that will reduce the cast time of all of your spells by 2.5 seconds. There are 2 main benefits to this. 1, you can now move around while casting Malefic or Gravity or Benefic, but much more importantly, we also can cast more abilities in between our Malefic windows. You see, when you're using an ability, you ideally don't want to interrupt the GCD from rolling by having to wait for the animation of your ability to play. So, the way we circumvent this is we do something called weaving. Weaving is when you use abilities in between the GCD, carefully avoiding interrupting it. Typically, abilities take about 1 second to finish their animation, so that means if we have a GCD with a 2-second cooldown, we can fit 2 abilities inside of it. The problem here is that while Malefic does have a 2.5 second cooldown, its cast time is taking up the majority of that and leaving us with only 1 second that we can use for abilities. Lightspeed doubles the amount of time we have to work with, kind of, and grants us enough time to get 2 abilities off instead. Now it is time for Divination. This ability grants all of your nearby party members a 6% damage buff for 20 seconds. And to compensate for how incredibly powerful this is, it has a 2-minute cooldown, because it is what is called a 2-minute burst. Every job in the game is designed around unleashing all of their most powerful attacks at the 2-minute mark, and then doing that repeatedly every 2 minutes until the fight is over. The Astro is no exception to that. As a matter of fact, they are one of the most important jobs for the 2-minute burst, because you are empowering everybody else's most powerful attacks in your party. So that is why we have to orient our draw cooldown around Divination. When we use Divination, we want to do it under the Lightspeed buff in order to let us quickly apply the Spear, the Balance, and the Lord of Crowns in quick succession. This means we have to manage our Lightspeed cooldown so that we always have 1 charge ready right before it's time to use Divination. Typically, you want to use it about 5 seconds before it's Divination time. Then, after you apply Divination, quickly grant the Balance to your melee DPS, or just the strongest DPS you have if there is no melee. Then we're going to use the Lord of Crowns, followed by redrawing our cards to get the Spear. Then we'll apply the Spear either to our most powerful ranged DPS, or if we don't have one, we just give it to whoever we gave the Balance to. If you are at or above level 92, you will have access to another action called Oracle. Oracle is just a massive AoE nuke attack that Divination will transform into after you use it. You can use it at any point during the Divination buff and you're completely fine, so you don't need to rush out Oracle. If you have healing you need to do after applying your damage buffs, that's perfectly fine. Just remember to use Oracle before Divination runs out. Now, where this becomes a little bit difficult is in the fact that all the while, as we're applying all these buffs, we still can't interrupt Malefic. We have to make sure Malefic is still coming out as soon as its cooldown is out. So, instead, when you are using your Divination burst window, it's gonna look a little something like this infographic that I shamelessly stole. Because you're going to have to do a lot of target changing in order to get all of your Malefics off while clicking on individual party members to buff them, it is really helpful to utilize 14's focus target system, or alternatively, the target of my target button. I would recommend using both. They are incredibly helpful for being able to swap back to the boss or the tank or whomever at a moment's notice without feeling like you're playing Osu. Personally, I will always focus target the boss when I start an encounter, and then I can just press my focus target button instead of having to look at the boss and tab target back to them. Alternatively, I can also utilize the target of my target button, so a lot of targets, for me, I have it set up to press T, and it will target the tank if I'm targeting the boss. Or if I'm targeting a DPS who is attacking the boss, I can press my T button, and it will instantly swap my target to the boss as well. So that's a really helpful way of bouncing around between targets. Some people like to set up macros, which you can also do, wherein you can put a button next to each party member's icon in the party list, and then clicking on that button will just give them the card. However, I personally really don't like this method of playing. There is some unnecessary input lag that is implemented from giving out buffs that way, and also you're an Astro. Rapidly swapping targets is what you do to heal as well. The macros can become quite redundant because you need to be comfortable swapping targets really fast to save allies who are about to die, so delegating your damage buffs to it is just a little bit excessive in my opinion. And now for the last of the 3 abilities I really wanted to highlight is Earthly Star. This ability is one of the most iconic things in the entirety of the Astro's kit, even more than its cards, and that is because it is so fucking bright. Earthly Star, as its name implies, conjures a star from the very heavens themselves here on Earth, which is a weird name because the planet 14 takes place on is not called Earth. But anyway, when you press Earthly Star, you will get this little aiming reticle, and you can then place the Earthly Star anywhere you want on the ground. The Earthly Star will then blow up when you either reactivate the ability or it naturally expires after 20 seconds. When Earthly Star explodes, it will heal all allies within its range and deal damage to all enemies in its range. And it has one more very important effect in that after 10 seconds have gone by, the Earthly Star will reach its empowered state. When it has reached its empowered state, its healing effect and its damage effect are considerably increased. In practice, this is going to mean you want to have Earthly Star on the ground 10 seconds before you need it so you can get its full value. And the Earthly Star at its full value is so incredibly powerful that it can take care of a majority of the healing that you and your co-healer will have to deal with during raids, trials, so on and so forth. Fortunately for you though, Earthly Star is actually a lot more simple to utilize in most content than it might sound, because we don't actually need to hold on to it and wait for the perfect moment. As a matter of fact, that would end up wasting Earthly Star. Instead, what we want to do is place it before the tank pulls the boss. Typically, we want to place it about 3 seconds in advance, but this does vary by fight. If you can't place it in advance, just drop it as soon as the fight begins. Then after the boss uses its first raid wide, you can confidently blow up the Earthly Star in its empowered state, getting the full heal and damage out of it. And from that point on, literally just use Earthly Star the very second it comes off cooldown. It's at a 1-minute cooldown, which means it will be coming up around the same time as your cards are ready to be drawn, but because the cards have that 5-second grace period between when you need to pull them and when they come off cooldown, you can instead use the Earthly Star first to keep its cooldown rolling. Now, of course, every fight has a slightly different timeline, so there are situations where you would need to delay the Earthly Star in order to get it to work. This is only going to be relevant to you though if you are doing high difficulty endgame raiding. Otherwise, just use it off cooldown, get the full value of that damage, and enjoy the healing. Now it's finally time to run through all of your healing tools. We've finished all of your damaging abilities, and the reason we did those first is because in 14, healers are designed damage first. Everything is, actually, which I'm not really a fan of, to be honest, but nevertheless, it is the way the game works, so I'm trying to give you everything in the most comprehensive and coherent order I can. But now it's time to start with Essential Dignity. This is a healing oGCD with a 40-second cooldown, and at max level, it comes with a total of 3 charges. It restores the HP of your target instantly, and the lower on health they are, the more powerful the heal becomes, capping out when your target is at 30% HP or lower. Collective Unconscious grants a 10% damage mitigation buff to everybody near you in your party. Additionally, your character will create a dome over their head, which will give a regen buff to anybody close enough to be inside the dome. For the next 18 seconds, the dome will persist as long as you don't move or press any buttons. Just flashing the dome up for like half a second is enough to apply the buffs to anybody who's going to get them, so there isn't any benefit in holding up the dome. Celestial Opposition. This is one of your go-to heals. It applies a heal to all nearby allies, as well as a regen effect for the next 15 seconds. Something to note is that both Collective Unconscious and Celestial Opposition, while they are AoE heals, should also be used during dungeon pulls to apply the buff to your tank. A lot of Astro players don't think to, and instead just hold on to these abilities until the boss fights start. But don't underestimate how much a few thousand extra HP worth of regen potency and a 10% mitigation can go for a tank who's currently dealing with 15 enemies at once. Celestial Intersection. This is one of your primary band-aid abilities. Slap it on somebody who's missing a bit of HP but isn't immediately going to die and needs an essential dignity first. Try to use these very freely because it has a very short cooldown, it's got 2 charges, and ultimately, the more of these shields you can get out, the less healing you're going to have to do overall. Exaltation applies a 10% damage mitigation buff to your target for 8 seconds. At the end of this 8-second duration, it will then apply a moderately sized heal to that target, making this another one of your delayed healing buffs. In dungeons and normal content, use Exaltation freely. Try to get as many of them off as you can, because an extra 10% mitigation and some free healing is an awesome thing to have when your tank is trying to handle big mob pulls. When you're doing high-end content like raids and such, it is nice to leave Exaltation for tank busters, because some of the end-game tank busters hit a lot harder than they used to in prior expansions. Following up Exaltation, we have the last of your delayed healing effects, and this one is the most complicated and difficult to use, but also the most powerful. Macrocosmos will grant all nearby party members a buff for 15 seconds. At the end of the buff's duration, your party members will be healed for half of the damage they took while they had the buff on them. The Astrologian player can also reactivate Macrocosmos prematurely, granting them the heal instantly without them having to wait the full 20 seconds. For one more example on how this functions, if your party was about to get hit by a raid-wide attack, you can activate Macrocosmos. Then reactivate it after they've taken the damage, and half of that damage will be given back to them as a heal. So if they took 10,000 damage from that raid-wide, Macrocosmos would heal them for 5,000 damage, plus its base heal of 200 potency, which is like nothing. Macrocosmos also does damage. It's actually on the GCD as well, but it can only be used once every 3 minutes. It will deal exactly as much damage as one Malefic would to the target closest to you, and then all other targets will take a reduced amount of damage. So you can actually just use this as a mobility tool if you don't want to use Lightspeed or Swiftcast, but you have to move to dodge a mechanic. You can just throw it away for some free damage while moving. But of course, during raids, trials, and what have you, proper utilization of Macrocosmos and Earthly Star will allow you to handle a majority of the heavy AoE healing you have to do without ever actually having to pause your damage output. Now it's time to go over the bulk of your healing kit. I've left these to the end of the video because many of them have drawbacks to use and are your last resort heals as a result. Some of these actions cost you damage to use or have really high MP costs or are just so high value but situational that they're not really the kind of thing you want to throw out immediately. These are your break glass in case of emergency healing buttons. First off, of the healing GCDs, we have Benefic 2. Benefic 2 is a GCD that applies one big instant burst heal. It costs a pretty hefty amount of MP, and that is basically it. We only use this action when we have no possible way to save somebody otherwise. Like I said, in lower level content, it's kind of your only way to save someone, so you'll actually use it quite a lot in those dungeons. But in the higher level content, you just have so many tools that it becomes a rarity that you actually have to rely on Benefic 2. And you might notice that you often go entire dungeon runs or raids without ever once touching Benefic 2. Now, alongside that, we also have Benefic 1. Benefic 1 is only used in, actually just 2 situations. One, you're in a dungeon that is below level 26, so you don't even have Benefic 2. Or, you are in a run that has gone to shit. To such an extreme degree of shit that none of your healing oGCDs are off cooldown. You don't have any cards ready to play, and you do not have enough MP left to cast even a single Benefic 2. This rarely ever happens, but it has happened to me on occasion, and it's actually how I managed to scrape my way through some of the hardest raids in the game with my old raid groups. Now, unless you really get into 14, this is not likely to be something that you'll experience a lot, if ever at all, but it can happen, so it is worth putting it on your bar. Next, we have Helios 2, or Helios Conjunction. They are the same button, they just transform into one another the same way Gravity becomes Gravity 2 and Malefic becomes Malefic 2, 3, 4, and fall. Helios 2/Conjunction, which I'm just going to call it Helios 2 from here on out. It is the exact same thing as Celestial Opposition. It's just a little bit worse because you have to use a lot of MP to cast it, and of course it's on the GCD, so you have to sacrifice a usage of Malefic or Gravity to get it off. Now, the benefit here is that you can use it on demand because it's only on a 2.5 second cooldown. So if shit hits the fan, like I was saying earlier, you can definitely lean on it, or of course use it in between pulls so that the buff is ready when the fight starts and you don't have to use it during the fight. However, do not spam Aspected Helios when you're in danger. Use it once and then swap to normal Helios, because Aspected Helios has a smaller base heal, but it applies a regen buff, whereas normal Helios 1 doesn't have a regen, but it does have a higher base heal. And Helios 1 is actually the exact same amount of healing as Lady of Crowns, for a point of reference. Aspected Benefic. Over your career playing Astro, this might end up being the GCD heal you use the most. It applies a very small heal to your target, however it also grants them a regen that will reapply that same amount of healing for the next 15 seconds. It also has no cast time, so we can weave two abilities inside of it, allowing us to save people who are on death's doorstep with not even a second to spare, with Aspected Benefic, Essential Dignity, and Celestial Intersection back to back. Neutral Sect. This ability is insanely powerful, utterly ridiculous, to the point where some players wonder why it's even still in the game. The only downside to it is that it only benefits your GCD heals, so using it typically means you are prepared to take a step back from dealing big damage and are instead ready to commit yourself to being an absolute healing machine. Now, what's good about that is when you are progging a high-end fight, damage doesn't matter until you've figured out how to stay alive. A tool that allows you to completely sacrifice damage in order to maximize the health of your entire party is ridiculously valuable. Now, how does Neutral Sect turn you into this healing machine? Well, Neutral Sect increases the potency of healing magic. Now, healing magic is important wording because that only applies to anything labeled as a spell, which typically only means GCDs. So activating Neutral Sect will not increase the healing potency of Essential Dignity. However, Neutral Sect does massively buff the potency of Aspected Benefic and Aspected Helios, causing them not just to grant a regen, but also a shield. This is particularly valuable when you're on a very dangerous encounter. You can simply say, fuck this, I'm done trying hard, press Neutral Sect, and begin spamming Aspected Helios/Conjunction, and nobody will die, probably. Additionally, when you reach level 100, you will get access to Sun Sign. Sun Sign is just another 10% party-wide mitigation that you can get access to on the off global, and upon using Neutral Sect, the button will simply be replaced with Sun Sign. So you can just use Neutral Sect prematurely so that you have Sun Sign ready, and then pop that for the mitigation, instead of ever actually using the Aspected Helios buff. It's entirely up to you. Horoscope grants a buff to all nearby party members. The Astrologian can then reactivate Horoscope to consume that buff and grant a heal to those party members. However, the heal is incredibly small. We can increase the size of the heal by casting Helios or any version of Helios once. That will transform the Horoscope buff into its Horoscope Helios version, doubling the amount of healing that it provides. We will use this ability either before a pull begins by casting Aspected Helios, then placing our Earthly Star, and then the tank pulls the fight, or if we find ourselves in a position where we know we cannot keep everybody alive without using a Helios, we use Horoscope first to maximize the value of Helios. Synastry is one of the most forgotten abilities in the entirety of the Astro's kit, so much so that most people don't even know how it works, including some other guides I've watched, which is impressive. So, Synastry grants a buff to a targeted party member. That buff will then duplicate any GCD healing you use on anybody to that player at 40% effectiveness. So if I was to give somebody the Synastry buff and then cast Benefic on a different player, the person with the buff would receive 40% of however much the person I casted Benefic on received. Additionally, I could put Synastry on somebody and then cast Benefic on that person, and they would just get 140% of the Benefic healing in one go. So the two ways you can use it is either to give one person a massive Benefic heal, or give two people a decent Benefic heal. Either way, it's what you use in an emergency situation where you have to use Benefic. And if you're going to have to be forced to stop using Malefic and swap to Benefic, you may as well get the most value you can by remembering to press Synastry first. And with that, you have made it through the entirety of my Zero to Hero Astrologian guide. I thank you very kindly for watching if you stuck the whole way through. I deeply appreciate it, and I really hope this helped. Some ending notes. If you have any questions about Astrologian, or honestly, I have 20,000 hours in this game, and all I do is teach people, so if you have questions about any job, go ahead and leave them in the comments, and I would be more than happy to help you figure it out. Additionally, I am trying to hit 1,000 subscribers. This is my first time making a guide for 14 in about 8 years, so if you enjoy it, go ahead and leave a sub, a like, a comment, all that fun stuff. I know I already said it, but apparently you're supposed to really hamper on with this kind of deal, so sorry. And, well, I suppose that's it. This video took me about 45 hours to write, script, voice, and edit, so thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Fare thee well.